When I first pressed play on Ballerina, 2025, I thought I was preparing for another sleek entry in the ever-expanding world of cinematic universes, a revenge thriller that might dazzle with choreography and neon, but perhaps fade quickly once the credits rolled. Instead, what I encountered was something that lingers, not only in the pulse of its action, but in the echoes of grief and resilience woven beneath. And as always, my friends who gather here in this small corner of reflection, if you value conversations that treat films not only as entertainment, but as mirrors of our own lives, I ask you to subscribe, to stay close, to walk with me as we unravel not just what a movie shows, but what it means. The opening moments are quiet, not loud. We are invited into silence before violence, into stillness before movement. A woman standing alone, her figure poised yet trembling, her body marked not by scars alone, but by loss. That silence struck me as a true beginning, because it established what the story would be at its core. Not only a ballet of vengeance, but a dance of mourning, a choreography of memory and pain. Watching her, I felt that strange recognition we often feel when cinema is honest. We know what it is to stand alone, to feel the emptiness of what has been taken, to summon strength not out of pride but necessity. From there, the narrative begins to unfurl like a tightly wound spring. What appears at first to be a simple revenge tale reveals itself as something far more layered. She does not move through the world with reckless abandon, but with precision, her training evident in every gesture, her control as much emotional as physical. The film teases us with fragments of backstory, moments of her past bleeding into her present, until we realize that every step she takes is choreographed by grief as much as by skill. I was reminded of how, in literature, the most powerful tragedies are never about what happens in the moment, but about what has already happened, the wounds carried into the present. The fight sequences, teased early, are not spectacles for their own sake. They are ballets in motion, harsh, precise, terrifying, yet strangely beautiful. The camera lingers not on chaos, but on rhythm, on the grace within brutality. Watching her strike and move, I thought of how grief itself can be choreographed, how loss can make us move through life in patterns we cannot escape. The story teases this with every clash, every narrow escape, every silence afterward when the violence recedes and the echoes of memory flood back in. As the first act develops, supporting figures emerge, mentors, adversaries, allies, but each of them feels less like plot devices and more like mirrors reflecting fragments of her own psyche. One ally embodies loyalty, another suspicion, another betrayal. Each of them foreshadows what she must face within herself. The story teases their importance early, but holds back their full weight, leaving us uneasy, leaning forward, wondering which ones will carry her further and which will tear her down. What moved me most in these opening movements was not the choreography of action, but the choreography of silence. Long pauses stretch across rooms, glances linger too long, footsteps echo down corridors. In those silences, the film speaks its loudest truths. That grief is not only loud with anger, but quiet with memory. That vengeance is not only about striking outward, but about enduring inward. Watching, I thought of my own silences, the moments after loss when words felt empty, when movement was the only language left. The tease of the larger world is subtle but deliberate. We glimpse the connections to broader mythologies, the assassins, the codes, the secret histories. But the film refuses to be swallowed by them. Instead, it uses those glimpses to heighten her isolation, to remind us that she is one among many, but that her pain is singular. That restraint fascinated me, because it showed that even within a shared universe, the focus could remain deeply personal. It reminded me of literature where characters walk through vast landscapes of history, yet carry their own singular griefs, their own personal narratives within the larger epic. As the introduction closed and the story settled into its rhythm, I realized that what I was watching was not just a thriller, but a meditation disguised as one. Every kick, every glance, every silence was part of a larger dance, one that spoke not only of vengeance, but the impossible task of carrying grief. And that realization left me leaning forward, ready to follow wherever the story would go, not because I craved resolution, but because I craved understanding. The story begins not in chaos, but in a memory, in the echo of music faintly heard, in the stretch of body trained to move with grace long before it learned to kill. The first images remind us that she was once a dancer, a ballerina, her body sculpted not only for performance, but for discipline, for control, for beauty turned into precision. And then, like a shadow falling across the stage, that training was claimed by another world. A darker stage where the audience is not art lovers, but the high table and its endless network of assassins. This contrast is the seed of everything that follows. Grace stolen by violence, art consumed by vengeance. When we meet her now, she is not dancing, but hunting. Rooney moves through the world with the stillness of someone carrying grief like a weapon. The camera lingers on her face, poised, unreadable, yet shadowed by memory. We learn quickly what drives her family, her people, taken from her by betrayal, by cruelty, by the same machinery that had once shaped her into a weapon. The motive is not hidden. It is announced in the silence of her eyes, in the quiet moments before she strikes. This is a story of vengeance, yes, but also of mourning. Every step she takes is a step into grief. The first act shows us her world, a familiar one to those who know its larger mythology, but focus entirely through her lens. She moves through the remnants of the Ballet Academy glimpsed briefly in earlier chapters of the saga, a place where children were molded into assassins under the guise of dancers. Here, the walls still echo with training drills, the smell of resin and sweat, the crack of instructors' voices. We see her as both student and survivor, remembering the discipline forced upon her, repurposing it now for her own ends. These scenes are haunting not because of action, but because of recognition. The body that once bowed to authority now moves freely, but with scars carved deep into memory. Her first mission is staged as both initiation and declaration. She tracks with the men tied to her family's death, moving through a neon-lit cityscape that feels at once dreamlike and suffocating. The fight itself is precise, brutal, but what lingers is how it is framed. Not as spectacle, but as choreography. Every strike feels like a dance step, every dodge like a pirouette turned into survival. It is violence made graceful, grief made physical. I thought of how often in life we transform pain into movement, how grief makes us restless, how sorrow makes us pace, how rage makes us tremble. Here, those movements are weaponized, turned into rhythm and brutality, but still rooted in the body's memory of dance. After this first mission, she seeks out guidance, allies, and we are reintroduced to familiar figures. Winston appears, his voice carrying both warning and admiration, a reminder of the codes that govern their world. Sharon stands beside him, dignified as ever, a quiet presence of loyalty and restraint. Their conversations with her are brief but heavy, each word carrying layers of meaning. They recognize her determination, but they also recognize the cost. Winston warns her, almost tenderly, that vengeance is a cage as much as grief. But his warning is met with silence. She has already chosen her path. John himself appears not as savior or guide, but as a shadow moving through her story. His presence is brief in this half, a reminder of another man consumed by vengeance, another soul bound in inevitability. Their meeting is quiet, not explosive. He looks at her as though seeing a reflection, and she looks at him as though glimpsing her possible future. No long speeches are exchanged, only recognition. Two people broken in different ways, walking parallel paths that will never truly diverge from violence. That silence between them is one of the most powerful moments of the first half, because it speaks of inevitability louder than words. The middle portion of the first half builds her mission outward. She hunts those responsible, following threads of betrayal through cities drenched in shadow and neon. Each confrontation is staged as both spectacle and symbol in one fight. She uses her ballet training explicitly, turning leaps and spins into strikes, movements once meant for art into weapons. The choreography here is breathtaking, but it is also haunting, because it symbolizes how beauty has been corrupted, how discipline has been consumed by violence. I thought of how in our own lives, the very skills we once nurtured for joy can be twisted into tools for survival when life demands it. Her allies, too, begin to emerge. Some are loyal, recognizing her strength and grief. Others betray, reminding us that in this world loyalty is rare, survival the only true code. Each interaction builds tension, foreshadowing not only more violence but more isolation. She is not gathering friends. She is shedding illusions. With each step, she grows more alone, more defined by her mission, more consumed by the inevitability of vengeance. The cinematography emphasizes her isolation. Wide shots frame her as a solitary figure against vast cityscapes. Close-ups linger on her expressionless face after battles, sweat and blood glistening, but no relief visible. Even moments of small victory feel hollow. The film wants us to feel the futility of vengeance, even as we thrill at its choreography. This duality is what makes the first half so powerful. It refuses to let us rest in spectacle, constantly pulling us back into grief. By the midpoint, she has carved a path of destruction, but also revealed her own fragility. Her body shows the toll. Her eyes show the weight. She sits in silence in a hotel room, staring at nothing, and in that silence we understand that vengeance does not heal. It fuels, it drives, but it does not fill the emptiness left behind. This is the emotional truth of the first half. That vengeance is movement without resolution, a dance that exhausts but never completes. As the first half closes, she sets her sights on those higher up the chain, the ones truly responsible, the ones tied directly to the machinery of power. The stakes rise, the danger grows, the inevitability presses closer. Yet what lingers is not only the promise of more violence, but the growing recognition that this path is endless. Like John before her, she has entered a cycle that will not stop until it consumes her. The first half leaves us in that unease, caught between exhilaration at her skill and sorrow at her futility. When the screen darkened for its pause, I felt both awe and heaviness. Awe at the choreography, the grace turned into violence, the spectacle rendered as poetry. Heaviness at the truth beneath. That grief cannot be erased by vengeance. That loss cannot be danced away no matter how precise the movements. That duality, that refusal of comfort, is what gives the first half its power. It leaves us leaning forward, knowing the second half will only deepen the tragedy, and yet unable to turn away. The second half begins with the weight of inevitability pressing down more heavily than before. The first half showed us vengeance as movement, grief as choreography, but now the momentum accelerates, the cycle tightening around her until every step feels predestined. Rooney is no longer simply chasing the men who wronged her. She is moving deeper into the machinery of the world that created both her and them. What once felt personal begins to blur into something larger, something systemic, and that realization makes her journey both more terrifying and more tragic. Her pursuit leads her to higher rungs of the chain, men and women who serve not just as individuals, but as embodiments of the power that has shaped her entire life. These encounters are not just fights, but symbolic confrontations. In one haunting sequence, she infiltrates a gathering of assassins held under the guise of a decadent performance, a masquerade of elegance that hides brutality. The setting mirrors her own past. Dance is cover for violence. Grace is mask for cruelty. The fight that unfolds there is breathtakingly brutal, yet also heartbreaking. She moves with precision, dispatching her enemies one by one. Yet with every strike we are reminded that she is still dancing in a performance choreographed by grief. Watching her move, I thought of how often life forces us to repeat patterns we thought we had escaped, reenacting old wounds in new forms. As she climbs higher toward those truly responsible, betrayal sharpens. Allies falter, promises crack, and we are reminded again of the code that governs this world. Loyalty is fragile, survival paramount. One supposed ally turns on her in a moment of vulnerability, and the betrayal feels less like shock and more like confirmation. Of course this is the way of things. Of course trust cannot hold in a world built on blood. That moment resonates not because it is surprising, but because it is inevitable, a reminder that vengeance isolates more than it liberates. Her body, too, begins to show the weight. Fights leave her bloodied, limping, exhausted. Yet she continues, driven not by hope of healing, but by refusal to stop. The cinematography emphasizes this erosion, her movements slower, her breaths heavier, her eyes clouded with fatigue. And yet the choreography never loses its grace. If anything, it grows more haunting as fragility creeps in. Watching her stumble and rise again, I thought of how grief consumes a body, how mourning is not only emotional but physical, draining us until movement itself becomes agony. Her body becomes a canvas of inevitability, painted in bruises and blood. A crucial meeting with John comes in this half, and it is staged not as a grand alliance but as a quiet parallel. They share few words, but what matters is the silence between them, the mutual recognition of people bound to the same cycle. He does not save her, and she does not save him. Instead, they acknowledge each other's paths, similar, tragic, endless. It is not comfort, but it is connection, a brief reminder that even in isolation, one can find mirrors. Their scene together functions less as plot and more as philosophy, a conversation without words about the futility of vengeance and the inevitability of collapse. As the narrative races toward its climax, she reaches those at the center of her grief, the ones who directly order the destruction of her family. These final confrontations are staged with operatic intensity. Each fight is not just a clash of bodies, but a collision of themes: grief versus power, art versus violence, memory versus oblivion. One sequence unfolds in a theater, empty of audience, where she moves across a stage that once hosted ballets. The symbolism is devastating. She was once a dancer. Now she is a killer. Yet here she returns to the stage not for applause, but for blood. The fight is choreographed like a performance, her movements echoing dance even as they kill. It is beautiful and horrifying, art twisted into vengeance. Watching it, I felt a chill, because it suggested that grief itself is a kind of performance, one that consumes us in rehearsals we never chose. When she finally faces the architect of her pain, the confrontation is not triumphant but weary. The fight is brutal, yes, but what lingers is the emptiness after. She kills, but the silence that follows is heavier than victory. The camera lingers on her face, bloodied, trembling, expressionless, and we see the truth. Vengeance has no resolution. The death of her enemy does not bring back her family, does not erase her grief, does not fill the hollow within. It is an ending, but not closure. That truth is devastating, and the film does not soften it. The aftermath is where the second half's real weight settles. She survives, but survival feels indistinguishable from collapse. She walks away from the stage, from the bodies, from the machinery of power, but her eyes are empty. She is not liberated. She is marked. The silence around her becomes suffocating, the absence of music more haunting than any fight. The film refuses to give her neat redemption or peace. Instead, it leaves her where John has always been, alive, but imprisoned by grief, free in body but chained in spirit. The final images mirror the beginning. A woman standing alone, poised yet trembling, her body still disciplined, her eyes still shadowed by loss. The cycle has come full circle. She has danced her dance, but the choreography continues beyond her. That is a tragedy, the recognition that grief is not ended by vengeance, that violence only perpetuates itself, that the cycle is endless. The credits roll not with triumph, but with inevitability. When the second half ended, I sat with heaviness in my chest, not because the fights weren't thrilling, they were, but because the silence afterward was unbearable. The story had shown me beauty within brutality, grace within violence, but it also stripped away illusions. It reminded me that grief is not healed by destruction, that vengeance is movement without rest, that silence follows us no matter how many battles we fight. And in that recognition, I understood why this film lingers. It does not give comfort. It does not offer redemption. It offers truth, raw and unavoidable, and it asks us to carry it with us into our own silences. When I think about what makes this story linger, it is not only the choreography of violence or the rhythm of its world, but the people who inhabit it, the human contradictions that breathe life into neon and shadow. Characters here are not mere placeholders in a revenge cycle. They are mirrors reflecting fragments of grief, loyalty, betrayal, and inevitability. To look closely at them is to look closely at ourselves, because in their silence, their gestures, their choices, we find truths about love, loss, and the masks we wear. At the center stands Rooney, and she is not framed as an unstoppable force, but as a fractured soul. Her identity is rooted in contradiction. Trained as a ballerina, disciplined into grace, then reshaped into a killer, disciplined into brutality. The body that once expressed beauty now expresses grief. Every movement a collision of art and violence. She is not driven by greed or ambition, but by loss, by mourning that is calcified into vengeance. What fascinates me is how the film never lets us forget her fragility. Yes, she fights with elegance, but in quiet moments we see the tremor in her hands, the heaviness in her eyes. She is not myth but woman, not invincible but exhausted. In her I saw a reflection of all of us who wear strength as armor while carrying fractures beneath. Her grief defines her more than her skill. Every strike she lands is choreographed by memory, every silence filled with faces she can no longer touch. This is what makes her compelling. She is not a machine of vengeance, but a human being drowning in absence. I thought often of how grief in my own life has shaped movement, how loss makes us walk differently, breathe differently, look at rooms differently. The performance captures this truth with subtlety, reminding us that vengeance is only the surface. Beneath it lies mourning that never ends. John Wick himself appears here not as protagonist, but as mirror. His presence is brief, but his shadow looms large. He is what she could become, a man defined entirely by loss, consumed by cycles of violence, respected and feared yet forever alone. When they meet, the silence between them says more than dialogue ever could. He looks at her with recognition. She looks at him with unease. And in that glance they both see inevitability. John is not mentor or savior. He is warning. His character here embodies a theme of endless cycles, the truth that vengeance does not heal but perpetuates. His role in her story is not to guide but to reflect, and that reflection is what makes his presence so powerful. Winston remains as enigmatic as ever, his words laced with elegance and danger. He recognizes her determination, but also her doom. He is not heartless. In fact, there are moments of near tenderness in his warnings. But Winston is bound to codes of his world, the rules of the Continental, and he knows that grief is not stronger than structure. His character here represents the tension between individuality and system. He sees her pain but knows it cannot dismantle the order he serves. Watching him, I thought of authority figures in life, those who sympathize yet ultimately reinforce the very structures that break us. Winston's presence is a reminder that power rarely bends for grief. Sharon, by contrast, embodies quiet dignity. His loyalty is steady, his demeanor calm, his words few but weighted. He does not lecture or warn as Winston does. Instead, he provides presence, stability in a chaotic world. His role here is small but essential, because he symbolizes humanity within machinery. When he helps her, it feels less like following code and more like compassion leaking through professionalism. His character reminded me that even in systems designed for cruelty, individuals can carry dignity, offering fragments of kindness in worlds that rarely deserve them. The adversaries she faces are varied, yet each functions less as individuals and more as embodiments of obstacles within herself. One is brutality without grace, a mirror of what she might become if she abandons discipline. Another is betrayal personified, an ally who turns, reminding us that trust is fragile in a world built on survival. Another is authority, an architect of her grief who embodies not personal cruelty, but systemic power. Each antagonist is symbolic. The dangers of losing discipline, the pain of betrayal, the futility of confronting structures larger than oneself. Together they form a gallery of inevitability, reminding us that grief externalizes itself in enemies we must confront. Even when the true enemy is within, her allies are few and fragile. Those who help her do so at great cost, often knowing their loyalty may be temporary. One mentor-like figure recognizes her pain and admires her strength, but cannot protect her. Their conversations are brief but intimate, filled with unspoken sorrow. This character represents the voices in our lives that urge us to slow down, to reconsider, to heal, but voices we often ignore when vengeance consumes us. Their presence is haunting because we know they are right, yet we also know she will not listen. Even the minor characters, the nameless assassins, the strangers in the underworld, carry symbolic weight. Each one is a reminder that she is not alone in her suffering, that this world is filled with people shaped by violence, each carrying grief of their own. Yet none of them escape the cycle, and that collective inevitability deepens the tragedy. They are not just extras. They are echoes, each death another reminder of the futility of her mission. Symbolically, the characters are not separate but interconnected. Rooney embodies grief as vengeance. John embodies grief as cycle. Winston embodies system. Sharon embodies dignity. Adversaries embody betrayal, brutality, and authority. Allies embody fleeting compassion. Together they weave a tapestry of human response to inevitability, denial, defiance, survival, betrayal, compassion, resignation. Each one reflects a path we might take when confronted with loss, and each one reveals the cost of that path. What struck me most, thinking about all of them together, is how the film refuses to give us heroes or villains in the traditional sense. Even the adversaries, though cruel, are products of the same system that shaped her. Even the allies, though kind, cannot save her. Every character is bound by the same inevitability, the same cycle of violence and grief. This refusal of simple categories makes the story feel heavier, more real, because life itself rarely gives us pure heroes or pure villains. Only people, fractured and flawed, each carrying their own burdens. By the time the credits roll, what remains is not just Rooney's face, but the constellation of faces around her. John's haunted silence, Winston's elegant warnings, Karen's dignified presence, the adversary's cruel reflections, the allies' fleeting tenderness. They linger not as separate threads, but as a woven fabric, the world pressing in on her and shaping her destiny. The character work here ensures that the story is not only about one woman's vengeance, but about the echoes of grief across community, across a system, across humanity itself. And when I reflect on them now, I realize that what makes them powerful is not their perfection, but their imperfection, not their victories, but their contradictions. They are flawed, fragile, human, even in a world of heightened violence. They remind us that characters and stories are never just characters. They are fragments of us, pieces of our own contradictions reflected back through neon and shadow. That is why they linger. That is why we carry them after the lights rise. Every film carries with a shadow story, a second narrative made up of odd coincidences, unusual choices, accidents, rituals, and whispers that never appear in the script but linger around production. These are the strange facts that often reveal more than the polished version we see on screen, because they remind us that movies are not machines but gatherings of fragile human beings, each carrying their own superstitions, humor, and exhaustion. With this film, the strangeness feels especially rich, because it is a story about choreography turned to violence, grief turned to vengeance, and inevitability haunting every step. Behind the camera, those themes bled into the process in ways that sometimes felt eerie, sometimes funny, sometimes unsettlingly poetic. One of the strangest facts lies in the casting itself. Ana de Armas was not only chosen for her presence, but because she insisted on doing the majority of her own stunts, training for months with real ballet instructors and martial artists simultaneously. The production blended two forms of training that rarely meet: pirouettes and knife disarms, arabesques and grapples, and watching her train became surreal. Crew members said there were moments when it was impossible to tell whether she was rehearsing choreography for a dance or a fight. That blurring of art and violence became a metaphor for film itself, strange and unsettling, as though the world of ballet had been pulled violently into the world of John Wick. Another strange fact is that the director, Len Wiseman, reportedly wanted the fights to be filmed as though they were performances staged for an audience. To achieve this, he brought in actual choreographers from European ballet companies to advise on fight scenes. They applied the same logic used for Swan Lake, or Giselda knife fights and gun battles. This choice was so odd it confused even stunt coordinators at first, but eventually it produced sequences that felt like dances of death. That merging of two art forms, ballet and assassin combat, wasn't just a gimmick, it was an experiment in aesthetics. It left everyone on set describing the fights not as brawls, but as recitals. A strange fact, but one that gave the film its singular rhythm. Superstition spread quickly on set. Because the film dealt with vengeance and grief, some cast and crew developed rituals before shooting scenes of death. Ana reportedly tapped the floor 3 times before certain takes, a habit borrowed from ballet stages where dancers ward off injury. Others avoided starting a scene on the 13th take, convinced it invited bad luck. One actor carried a small charm in his shoe during every fight scene, insisting it kept him from injury. Rational minds laugh, but the rituals stuck. They became part of the rhythm production. Strange gestures woven into the choreography of making the story. Accidents became part of mythology, too. During one fight rehearsal, Ana miscalculated a kick and shattered a light fixture above her. The shower of glass looked so cinematic that the director asked the stunt team to replicate it deliberately in the actual scene. What began as a mistake became a highlight of the choreography. On another occasion, a stunt double slipped during a spin and tumbled awkwardly, only for Wiseman to remark that the stumble looked too real to waste. They wove it into the fight, making the imperfection part of the design. These accidents remind us that strangeness often comes not from planning, but from chaos embraced. The music carried its own unusual facts. Composer Marco Beltrami blended classical ballet scores with electronic pulses, creating tracks where Tchaikovsky-like strings were interrupted by sharp industrial beats. Some test audiences described it as haunting and uncomfortable, and that discomfort was intentional. The idea was to mirror the protagonist's life. Elegance disrupted by violence, beauty corrupted by inevitability. One particularly strange track sampled the sound of point shoes hitting wooden floors, distorted until it sounded like gunfire. The fusion of sound design and score blurred lines between art and brutality, turning the act of listening into unease. Another odd fact. Keanu Reeves, though only appearing briefly, trained again in stunt choreography not for his own scenes but to help Anna rehearse. He insisted on sparring with her, giving her feedback, teaching her the rhythm of Wick-style combat. Crew members described watching the two of them move together as eerie, like watching one legend pass the torch through body language alone. His presence on set, even when not filmed, shaped the atmosphere, and Anna later admitted his support gave her the confidence to throw herself into the most grueling sequences. That behind-the-scenes mentorship feels strange not because it's unusual for actors to help one another, but because here became a symbolic echo of the story itself. One broken assassin silently acknowledging another. Filming locations carried peculiar energy too. Many sequences were shot in abandoned theaters, real places where ballet had once been performed decades ago. Dusty curtains, creaking floors, broken chandeliers. Spaces haunted not by ghosts but by echoes of art. Crew members reported odd sensations in these theaters. Sudden drafts, faint creaks, the eerie silence of empty performance halls. Shooting scenes of violence in places once dedicated to beauty created a strange atmosphere. Some even said it felt sacrilegious, like corrupting sacred ground. Yet that unease is visible in the film. It seeps into the shots, into the way characters move through those spaces. The strangeness of the location became part of the story's texture. Editing the film brought its own peculiarities. The editors reported feeling disoriented after weeks of cutting fight sequences choreographed like ballets. I started dreaming of pirouettes ending in stabbings. One confessed in an interview. The line between violence and art blurred not only on screen, but in their minds. One even joked that they couldn't listen to classical music for months afterward without imagining gunfire layered over it. Strange facts like these remind us that stories infect their creators, shaping the way they see the world even after the cameras stop. The box office story added more strangeness. During early test screenings, audiences reportedly erupted into applause after fight sequences, not because of excitement but because they were overwhelmed by the sheer choreography. One critic described it as the first time I've seen ballet audiences and action fans react the same way. That odd blend of cultures, art lovers and action lovers responding in unison, was one of the strangest outcomes of the film. It proved that strangeness can also be synthesis, that unlikely audiences can be bound together by something new. And then there are the myths that surround production, the whispers not always verifiable but repeated like folklore. Some said Anna injured her foot during a point rehearsal, but insisted on finishing the fight scenes anyway, hiding her limp on camera. Others claimed that Keanu improvised lines not in the script, offering words that resonated so deeply they left crew members silent. Whether true or exaggerated, these whispers matter, because they reveal how stories accumulate mythology even as they are made. When I gather all these strange facts together, the blending of ballet and combat, the superstitions, the accidents turned into art, the eerie theaters, the mentoring presence of Keanu, the haunted editing rooms, I see more than anecdotes. I see a portrait of a production shaped by the same contradictions as the film itself. Beauty and brutality, discipline and chaos, ritual and accident, all colliding to create something haunting. These facts may be strange, but they are not trivial. They remind us that cinema is not only illusion but process, and that process is always strange, always human, always haunted by the very truths the story is trying to tell. And in the end, perhaps the strangest fact of all is not the accidents or superstitions, but the silence that followed screenings. The film left audiences stunned, unsettled, unable to speak. That silence became its own behind-the-scenes story, not captured in credits but carried in memory. It is a strange fact, but also the most beautiful one, that a story choreographing grief could create silence heavy with recognition in the lives of strangers. To look at this story critically is to recognize that every event is layered, that what appears on the surface as choreography of violence is in fact philosophy in motion. Each encounter, each silence, each betrayal is staged not only for plot but for reflection, asking us to consider grief, vengeance, and the inevitability of cycles. The events of the film become less about a woman seeking revenge and more about a meditation on what revenge does to the human soul, what systems demand of us, and how grief transforms the very spaces we inhabit. The earliest events already subvert familiar tropes. We expect immediate spectacle, yet what we are given is silence. Rooney standing alone, her figure poised not for triumph but for mourning. From a critical perspective, this opening critiques the assumption that vengeance narratives must thrill before they reflect. Instead, it insists that grief is a beginning, that violence must emerge not as entertainment but as extension of absence. This quiet beginning sets the tone for everything that follows, forcing us to approach not with adrenaline but with empathy. The first mission, the first kill, is framed as performance. Critics have noted how the choreography blurs ballet and combat, turning violence into dance. But beneath the aesthetic lies critique, that beauty can be corrupted, that art can be consumed by systems of brutality. Watching her fight, we are entranced by grace, yet horrified by purpose. The event becomes a critique of our own gaze. Why do we find beauty in violence? Why do we applaud choreography that masks grief? The film holds up a mirror not only to a protagonist, but to its audience. Her encounters with Winston and Sharon deepen the critical layers. Winston's elegance and warning symbolize authority that sympathizes but does not save. He embodies the contradiction of power, aware of grief yet complicit in systems that perpetuate it. From a critical perspective, his events critique authority structures in general, showing how those in power recognize suffering yet maintain the codes that enforce it. Sharon, by contrast, symbolizes dignity within cruelty, his quiet loyalty reminding us that even in corrupted systems, fragments of humanity remain. Together, their events ask us to consider the roles we play in systems larger than us, whether we reinforce, resist, or soften them. The meeting with John Wick, though brief, is one of the most significant events when viewed critically. Their silence speaks louder than dialogue. Critics have interpreted this as a passing of the torch, but can also be read as a philosophical conversation without words. John is a mirror of inevitability, a man consumed by the very path she has chosen. Their encounter critiques the illusion of uniqueness in vengeance narratives. Her story is not hers alone. It is part of a cycle, one repeated endlessly. This event is not cameo but critique, reminding us that revenge does not liberate but replicates. As the plot advances into betrayals, the events grow heavier. Allies who falter and friends who turn symbolize the fragility of trust in a world governed by survival. These betrayals are not merely dramatic twists. They critique the impossibility of loyalty when systems reward selfishness. One betrayal in particular, when an ally delivers her enemies, lands with inevitability rather than shock. Critics have noted how the film refuses to glamorize trust, instead portraying it as brittle, constantly broken. These events remind us that vengeance isolates, that the pursuit of justice in corrupt systems often leaves us more alone than before. The fights of the second half, staged in abandoned theaters and decaying performance spaces, become symbolic events of their own. Critics have called these sequences operatic because they merge art and brutality so explicitly. Yet their critical significance lies in their setting. Violence unfolding on stages once meant for beauty critiques the consumption of art itself, suggesting that culture often masks cruelty, that beauty can be twisted into spectacle. When Rooney kills across a stage, moving like a dancer but striking like a killer, the event critiques not only her grief but our desire to aestheticize pain. It forces us to see the corruption of art when repurposed by violence. The climax, her confrontation with the architect of her grief, is another event loaded with meaning. On the surface, it is resolution, enemy faced, vengeance enacted, but critically it refuses closure. She kills, but the silence that follows critiques the illusion of catharsis. Revenge stories often promise healing through destruction, but here destruction leaves only emptiness. Critics have praised this refusal of neat resolution as one of the film's greatest strengths. It transforms the climax from resolution into revelation. Vengeance does not restore, only continues absence. This event critiques not only vengeance narratives in cinema, but the human longing for closure where none exists. The final images, her standing alone again, echo the opening, turning the narrative into a cycle. Critics have debated whether this is nihilistic or honest. To me, it is a necessary critique. It rejects the lie that stories must end with growth or redemption. Instead, it insists that grief lingers, that vengeance cannot erase absence, that silence remains. This cyclical structure critiques not only the character's journey, but storytelling conventions themselves. It reminds us that tragedy does not resolve neatly, that silence is often the only honest conclusion. Even smaller events, when examined critically, reveal layers of meaning. The pills she swallows critique the numbing of pain in all its forms, whether through substances or distractions. The trophies of her enemies critique the hollowness of victory. The glances with strangers critique the impossibility of intimacy when violence defines identity. Each small detail becomes an event in miniature, carrying symbolism that critiques the illusions we cling to in our own lives. Audience responses to these events confirm their weight. Critics wrote of the unease of applauding choreography that masked brutality. Audiences described the silence after screenings as more haunting than any fight. These responses themselves became part of the critical story. The events did not end on screen. They continued in the silence of theaters, in the discomfort conversations, in the recognition that we too aestheticize pain when we consume stories like this. The film critiques not only its characters but us, its viewers, demanding that we reflect on why we find beauty in violence, why we see catharsis in destruction. Looking at the events as a whole, the critical perspective reveals a tapestry of contradictions. Beauty and brutality, love and betrayal, silence and spectacle, inevitability and futility, all collide. Each event critiques the illusions of vengeance, the fragility of trust, the exploitation of art, the futility of closure. Together they form a narrative less about resolution than about reflection, less about victory than about recognition. What I carry with me, thinking critically about these events, is not despair, but awareness. Awareness that stories can unsettle rather than soothe, that cinema can critique even as it entertains, that silence can be more powerful than applause. The events of this film remind us that vengeance is a cycle, that grief lingers, that beauty can be corrupted, that systems consume individuals, that silence is the truest conclusion. These are not just critiques of characters or plot. They are critiques of us, of our world, of the illusions we live by, and in that recognition, the film achieves something rare. It becomes not just another entry in a shared universe, but a meditation on human fragility, delivered through events choreographed as violence, yet resonant as philosophy. That is the real significance of its critical perspective. It shows us ourselves, not as we wish to be, but as we are, fragile and searching, endlessly dancing in cycles we cannot escape. Every film is two stories woven together. The one we see projected on the screen, polished and deliberate, and the one lived in the sweat and laughter, the exhaustion and accidents production. With this film, that second story feels as compelling as the first, because the process of making a ballet of violence required the collision of disciplines, the endurance of bodies, and the persistence of artists who carry grief and beauty alike. The fun facts and insights of its making are not trivial. They are fragments of truth that deepen our understanding of how art emerges, messy and strange, from human labor. One of the most striking insights is how much Ana de Armas committed to inhabiting both worlds of her character, ballet and combat. She trained for months under the guidance of professional ballerinas, relearning point work she had not practiced since childhood. At the same time, she immersed herself in martial arts choreography, weapons drills, and stunt work. The combination of the two regimens was punishing. Trainers reported that her days sometimes stretched to 10 hours of practice, alternating between dance studios and fight gyms. Her body carried the marks of both. Bruises on shins from sparring, blisters on toes from point shoes. The production team later admitted they worried for her health, but Anna insisted on authenticity. That dual commitment became the heartbeat of the film, a fun fact that reveals how seriously she treated the fusion of grace and brutality. The director, Len Wiseman, carried his own vision that shaped the entire production. Known for action films, he approached this project differently, insisting that every fight be designed like a dance recital. To achieve this, he brought in choreographers from classical ballet companies to collaborate with stunt coordinators. This unlikely partnership produced sequences that felt hauntingly unique. Violence staged with the rhythm and precision of Swan Lake, but corrupted into something darker. Crew members describe rehearsals where ballerinas and fighters moved side by side, comparing pirouettes to spins, leaps to kicks, adagios to grapples. It was surreal, even amusing at times, but it created a strange alchemy that gave the film its distinct tone. This odd collaboration is one of those fun insights that explains why the fights look unlike anything else in the genre. Production design carried its own peculiarities. Many sequences were filmed in abandoned theaters and decaying performance spaces. These locations were chosen for their authenticity: peeling paint, broken chandeliers, dusty curtains. But they also created eerie atmospheres. Crew members joked about hearing whispers in the wings or footsteps on empty stages. Whether haunted or not, the spaces lent weight to the story, making the collision of ballet and violence feel tangible. One fun fact is that some of these theaters were once actual ballet schools in Eastern Europe, long closed but still carrying the echoes of art. Filming violence in these places added a symbolic layer no set could replicate. The costume team faced its own challenges. Designing attire that blended ballet with assassin aesthetics required invention. They created dresses reinforced for stunts, shoes modified for combat, fabrics that could look delicate yet withstand falls and fights. One dress, used in a climactic scene, reportedly tore 8 times during rehearsals because the choreography was so punishing. The team finally wove in hidden armor beneath its silk, making it as much a piece of weaponry as clothing. These details never fully show on screen, but they reveal the hidden craft behind the elegance. Stunts provided endless stories of resilience and humor. Anna insisted on doing the majority herself, which led to both triumphs and accidents. In one rehearsal, she spun on point and accidentally kicked a stuntman harder than intended, leaving him momentarily stunned. He laughed afterward, saying he'd been knocked out by Swan Lake, and the joke spread across the set. Another time, a fall from a balcony went wrong, leaving her with a bruised hip. Production paused briefly, but she returned the next day, determined. These accidents became part of the mythology of the shoot, proof of the risks behind the grace. The music carried fun insights, too. Composer Marco Beltrami experimented with unusual sounds, recording point shoes striking wooden floors and blending them with gunfire samples. He layered classical strings with electronic distortion, creating tracks that felt both elegant and unsettling. One fun fact is that during recording sessions, he invited actual ballerinas to dance in the studio, then distorted the sound of their movements into percussive rhythms. This kind of experimentation gave the score its uncanny quality, making it feel like grief itself had been set to music. Keanu Reeves' involvement brought another layer of insight. Though his role was limited on screen, he reportedly spent significant time on set, mentoring Anna and rehearsing fight sequences with her. Crew members said his presence felt like a quiet blessing, a continuity of the world for which the story emerged. He offered advice, encouragement, and even participated in warm-ups with stunt teams. For Anna, his support was invaluable, helping her find confidence in sequences that pushed her beyond her limits. This behind-the-scenes mentorship mirrored the on-screen dynamic between their characters: silent recognition, quiet guidance, mutual understanding. Morale on set was maintained by humor. The heaviness of the story required balance, and cast and crew found it in small rituals. Between takes, music blared, sometimes classical, sometimes pop, sometimes absurdly cheerful songs that clashed with the blood on screen. Arm wrestling contests became a daily occurrence among stunt performers, while the makeup team staged competitions for the most realistic bruises. Birthdays were celebrated with cakes shaped like ballet slippers and pistols, a blend of the two worlds. These light-hearted facts remind us that even in telling heavy stories, people insist on laughter. The editing process brought its own strange challenges. Editors reported that cutting fight scenes choreographed like ballets was disorienting. The rhythm felt like music, not violence, and they found themselves treating action sequences like symphonies, searching for crescendos and rests. One editor confessed he could not listen to classical music without imagining bloodshed for months afterward. The blending of forms infected not only the film, but the minds of those who shaped it. Marketing carried peculiarities too. Test screenings left audiences silent, not cheering. Studios worried at first, thinking silence meant rejection, until they realized it was awe. That hush became part of the marketing strategy, the film that left theaters silent. A strange but powerful fact, revealing how silence can sell as much as spectacle. Looking at all of these production insights and fun facts together, what emerges is a portrait of resilience, experimentation, and humanity. The fusion of ballet and combat, the haunted theaters, the bruises and laughter, the rituals and accidents, all of them remind us that cinema is not magic, but craft, not perfection, but persistence. The strangeness of the process mirrors the strangeness of the story, beauty and brutality entwined until they cannot be separated. And in the end, perhaps the most fun fact of all is not about stunts or costumes or music, but about the people themselves. Cast and crew describe leaving production altered, not only exhausted but reflective, carry with them the recognition that grief and grace are inseparable, that art and violence are often entangled, that silence can be as powerful as sound. That, I think, is the truest insight, that even in making illusion, they discovered truth, and that truth lingers in the stories they told behind the camera as much as in the ones we witnessed on screen. What makes a story endure in memory is not only the choreography of vengeance, but the world in which that choreography unfolds. The settings breathe with as much weight as the characters, and the cinematic elements, the choices of light, sound, rhythm, and framing, shape how we experience grief, violence, and inevitability. In this film, places are never neutral. Every space carries meaning. Every angle speaks a contradiction. Every silence becomes a character of its own. To explore the setting in cinematic design is to look not only at locations, but at psychology, at how the world itself becomes a mirror of Rooney's loss. The Ballet Academy, glimpsed early and then revisited, is one of the most haunting settings. Once a space of discipline and beauty, it is now remembered and reframed as a crucible of violence. The cracked mirrors, the echoing floors, the smell of resin mingle with sweat. All of these details remind us that training for art was reshaped into training for death. The cinematography lingers on the details. Point shoes dangling like relics, photographs of dancers staring down like ghosts, a stage lit too brightly to hide the scars of its past. In this setting, the film reminds us that no space is innocent, that institutions built for beauty can be corrupted into tools of control. It made me think of how many places in life, schools, homes, even friendships, carry scars of what they once were, haunted by what they became. The cityscapes she moves are drenched in neon, but unlike many stylized action films, the neon here feels less glamorous than oppressive. Streets glow with unnatural light. Windows reflect distorted faces. Alleys pulse with menace. This is a city alive but hostile, its beauty tinged with danger. Wide shots place her as a solitary figure against towering structures, shrinking her presence, reminding us of her isolation. At night, the streets are soaked in rain, turning reflections into a constant motif. Her face fractured in puddles, her movements doubled and distorted. Symbolically, the city reflects her fractured identity, her constant doubling between ballerina and assassin, between grief and vengeance. The abandoned theaters where some of the most intense battles unfold are among the most powerful settings. These are spaces once meant for performance, now decayed, their chandeliers broken, curtains torn, floors warped. Filming violence in such spaces creates layers of meaning. The theater becomes both stage and grave, performance and collapse. In one sequence, she fights across a stage where dancers once bowed to applause, but now bodies fall in silence. The symbolism is undeniable. art corrupted into violence, beauty twisted into bloodshed. Watching these scenes, I thought of how grief itself often reclaims the places of joy, how memories of laughter become stages of sorrow. The theaters here symbolize that truth with brutal elegance. Hotels appear frequently, and they carry the same weight as in other stories of this universe. Sterile, anonymous, silent. Rooms lit by single lamps, sheets too white, tables cluttered with weapons. These spaces symbolize isolation, the emptiness that follows vengeance. The cinematography emphasizes stillness, shots of her lying awake, eyes open in the dark, framed against the vast emptiness of a bed too large for one. The hotel is not refuge but prison, a symbol of how the life she inhabits strips away intimacy. It reminded me of times I stayed in anonymous rooms, places that felt like they belonged to no one, where I felt myself dissolve into silence. The film captures that unease with haunting clarity. Lighting becomes one of the film's most eloquent tools. In fights, it is harsh, bright, unforgiving, exposing every bruise, every drop of sweat. In private moments, it is dim, fractured, often from single sources like lamps, candles, or neon signs. Shadows swallow her face, half in darkness, half in light, embodying the contradictions of her identity. One unforgettable image shows her sitting at a vanity, half of her reflected face lit brightly, the other half obscured, symbolizing both her fractured self and the duality of art and violence. Light here is not merely illumination. It is storytelling, sculpting grief into visibility. Sound design amplifies the atmosphere. In battles, the rhythm of movement is heightened. The sharp crack of bones, the hollow thud of fists, the breathless gasps of exertion. Yet often the fights end with sudden silence, the absence of sound pressing heavier than noise. In quieter scenes, we hear subtle details exaggerated, the scrape of shoes on wood, the echo of footsteps in empty halls, the faint hum of electricity in sterile rooms. Even the sound of point shoes becomes symbolic, amplified until it resembles gunfire, a merging of art and violence. These choices immerse us not only in action but in emotion, reminding us that sound itself can embody grief. Color palette shifts slowly, deliberately. Early moments carry traces of warmth, golden hues that suggest remnants of life before vengeance. But as the story progresses, those tones fade into cold blues, harsh grays, and blood reds. The world drains of vibrancy, mirroring her hollowing. Red becomes intrusion, blood splashing against pale walls, neon signs glowing ominously, curtain stained. The gradual desaturation symbolizes not only her descent, but the futility of her mission. By the end, the palette feels drained of life, the world itself echoing her emptiness. The camera is both intimate and oppressive. In action sequences, it circles fluidly, treating fights like dances, every movement captured with rhythm. But in moments of grief, it lingers uncomfortably, holding still on her face as she trembles, refusing to cut away. These choices force us not only to watch but to feel, to live in her discomfort rather than escape it. One particularly haunting shot follows her from behind as she walks down a long corridor, the camera refusing to cut, the sound of her footsteps echoing endlessly. It feels oppressive, claustrophobic, embodying inevitability without a single word spoken. Editing carries symbolic weight. Battles are cut quickly, rhythmically, like musical crescendos. But moments of grief are drawn out, time stretched until seconds feel unbearable. Cross-cutting between fights and memories blurs past and present, reminding us that every strike is choreographed by loss. In one sequence, cuts between her fighting and flashes of her family create a rhythm that feels almost like heartbeat, only breaks suddenly into silence when the fight ends. Editing here is not just structure, but poetry, a way of weaving grief into every frame. Even small details of setting carry meaning. A pair of point shoes hanging from a mirror symbolizes a life stolen. A cracked mirror symbolizes fractured identity. A hallway lined with portraits of dancers becomes a gallery of ghosts. These details remind us that symbolism is not abstract, but rooted in objects, that grief clings to the tangible as much as to memory. What makes these cinematic elements so powerful is how they align with theme. Settings are not backdrops. They are embodiments of grief. Lighting is not decoration. It is philosophy. Sound is not accompaniment. It is memory. Editing is not mechanical. It is emotional rhythm. Together, they create a world that feels haunted, not by ghosts, but by inevitability, by the weight of grief that refuses to dissipate. When I left the theater, what lingered in my mind were not only the characters, but the spaces. The empty theaters, the rain-soaked streets, the silent hotels, the fractured light across her face. These settings became symbols, carrying weight beyond the story. They made me look at my own world differently, at the way spaces carry memory, at the way silence echoes, at the way light shapes our perception of grief. That, I think, is the real achievement of the film's cinematic design. It reshapes the way we see not only fiction but reality. Every film carries with it a hidden narrative, the story of its own creation, lived not by characters but by the people who shape them, who stand behind cameras, who bruise and sweat to build illusions. With this film, the behind-the-scenes story feels as heavy and fascinating as the one told on screen, because the making of Ballet of Vengeance required the convergence of art and brutality, patience and exhaustion, and the strange resilience of people bound together by a shared vision. To listen to the cast and crew describe the experience is to realize that the themes of grief, discipline, and inevitability seep not only into the fiction, but into production itself. Ana de Armas, at the center of it all, gave herself fully to the role. She trained for months with ballerinas and martial artists alike, reshaping her body into a vessel of grace and violence. Crew members said her commitment bordered on frightening. 10-hour training days that left her bruised, blistered, and limping, yet still returning the next morning to repeat it. In interviews later, she admitted the training changed her not only physically, but psychologically. "I felt like I was living as her," she said softly, describing nights when she dreamed of choreography that turned into combat, of performances where the audience was faceless. That blurring of art and violence haunted her, and it is visible in the authenticity of her performance. Her behind-the-scenes journey mirrors Rooney's: discipline, exhaustion, persistence, and a quiet weight of grief carried in movement. Keanu Reeves' presence added another layer of humanity. Though his role in the story is brief, he spent weeks on set rehearsing with Anna, mentoring her in the rhythm of Wick-style choreography. Stunt coordinators spoke of how his body carried memory, how his movements seemed second nature after years in the role. His generosity left a mark on the set. He sparred with her during rehearsals, offered guidance, encouraged her when fatigue set in. Anna herself said his presence gave her confidence, that his quiet reassurance made the impossible feel possible. This behind-the-scenes mentorship paralleled their on-screen connection. Two souls recognizing each other through silence, bound by grief and inevitability. Director Len Wiseman shaped the production with his unusual vision. He insisted the fights be staged like ballets, bringing in choreographers from classical companies to collaborate with stunt teams. Behind the camera, rehearsals look surreal. Ballerinas in practice attire moving alongside stunt fighters, comparing spins and leaps, trading techniques. Crew members laughed at first at the odd pairing, but soon realized it was creating something extraordinary. The choreographers demanded precision, the fighters demanded brutality, and together they built sequences that felt both graceful and terrifying. Wiseman reportedly paced like a conductor during these rehearsals, counting beats, urging movements into rhythm. He treated each fight like a symphony, each blow like a note, and that approach gave the film its strange elegance. Production design brought its own insights. Many sets were not sets at all, but abandoned theaters and real ballet schools in Eastern Europe. The spaces were crumbling. Peeling walls, broken chandeliers, warped floors, but that decay added authenticity. Shooting in such places carried an eerie atmosphere. Crew members whisper about odd sounds, sudden drafts, the feeling of being watched. Rational minds dismissed it as old buildings settling, but the unease lingered. Filming violence in spaces once filled with beauty created a strange heaviness that bled into performances. Some even said the buildings themselves became characters, their silence pressing as heavily as any actor. Stunt work produced endless stories of resilience. Anna insisted on performing most of her own stunts, which led to both triumphs and accidents. During one sequence, she misjudged a leap and landed awkwardly, bruising her ankle. Production paused briefly, but she returned quickly, refusing to let the injury stop her. Stunt performers describe her as fearless, even reckless, throwing herself into sequences with the same discipline she applied to ballet. One joked that she was the only ballerina who can kill you mid-pirouette. Accidents, though, became part of the mythology. In one rehearsal, a glass fixture shattered when struck by a miscalculated move. The shards fell around her, sparkling underlights, and Wiseman insisted the moment be recreated deliberately in the final cut. Mistakes became art, accidents became choreography, life and fiction blurred. The crew carried their own rituals to survive the heaviness. Between takes, they blasted absurdly cheerful music, pop anthems, disco tracks, even children's songs, turning grim sets into moments of levity. Makeup artists joked constantly about their work, competing for the most realistic bruises, laughing about how their hands smelled permanently of fake blood. Birthdays were celebrated with cakes shaped like ballet slippers crossed with pistols, a perfect emblem of the film's fusion of beauty and brutality. These small rituals were not trivial. They were survival, ways of balancing the gloom of the story with the resilience of laughter. Music creation added another layer of strangeness. Marco Beltrami recorded point shoes tapping against wooden floors, then distorted the sounds until they resembled gunfire or heartbeat. He layered classical strings with electronic pulses, creating tracks that felt like grief itself turned into rhythm. In behind-the-scenes interviews, he admitted he wanted the score to sound like a memory unraveling, and crew members described feeling unsettled even during recording. Some tracks haunted them afterward, the sound distorted ballet movements echoing in their dreams. The process of making the music infected the minds of those who shaped it, proving again how deeply stories seep into reality. Editors carried similar burdens. Cutting fight sequences designed like ballets was disorienting. They described the rhythm as musical, not mechanical, and admitted to feeling lost in loops of movement. One said they dreamed of sequences replaying endlessly, unable to escape the rhythm. Another admitted they had to take breaks from classical music entirely, because it triggered memories of editing bloodshed. This insight reveals how stories consume not only audiences but creators, shaping perception long after the workday ends. Even test screenings became part of the behind-the-scenes story. Producers worried at first when audiences did not clap, but sat in silence after credits. They thought silence meant failure. But soon they realized silence was the truest success. Viewers were unsettled, haunted, unable to speak. That hush became part of the film's mythology, marketed as a feature rather than a flaw. Crew members spoke later how proud they were that silence had become the audience's review. It felt like validation of their hard work, proof that the story had reached deeply enough to still tongues. Looking at all of this together, the bruises and blisters, the haunted theaters, the laughter and pranks, the rituals and accidents, the dreams of editors and the silence of audiences, what emerges is a portrait of resilience. The people behind the film endured exhaustion, confusion, even fear, but they also carried each other with humor and tenderness. They created something that was not only illusion but truth, not only spectacle but meditation. The behind-the-scenes story is not lighter than the film. It is its parallel, shaped by the same contradictions of beauty and brutality, fragility and strength, grief and resilience. What stays with me, reflecting on these insights, is a reminder that cinema is never mechanical. It is made by people, fragile and flawed, who give pieces of themselves to stories. And when the story is about grief and inevitability, those pieces are heavier. Yet they persisted, they endured, they laughed, they created. That, I think, is the truest behind-the-scenes insight, that even in telling a story about silence, collapse, and loss, human beings insisted on connection, on resilience, on creating beauty in the very act of depicting destruction. What lingers most after the final image fades is not the choreography of the fights, or even the thrill of vengeance, but the quiet weight of the ideas pulsing beneath them, the themes that shape the story, and the symbols that haunt its every frame. This is a film that lives as much in metaphor as in movement, where a pirouette can carry the weight of grief and a shadow can speak louder than dialogue. To talk about its themes is to talk about what it says about loss, about violence, about beauty corrupted, about the cycles we cannot escape. The most resonant theme is grief itself. Grief not as a temporary wound, but as a condition of being. Rooney is defined by it. Every gesture, every silence, every strike choreographed by absence. Grief here is not framed as something to be overcome, but as something to be carried, something that shapes identity until there is no separation between the person and the loss. This is why vengeance feels less like choice and more like inevitability. She is not simply avenging, she is embodying grief, letting it move through her body like muscle memory. Watching her reminded me of how grief changes us, not only emotionally but physically. The way we walk, the way we breathe, the way silence settles into our bones. The film captures that truth with unflinching clarity. Closely intertwined is the theme of vengeance. But vengeance here is stripped of the glamour often attached to it in cinema. It is not cathartic, not redemptive, not triumphant. It is repetitive, exhausting, corrosive. Every death she delivers leaves her emptier, not fuller. This theme critiques not only the narrative of vengeance in fiction, but our human desire for closure through destruction. The story insists on futility of such desire, showing us that vengeance does not erase grief but deepens it. In this sense, vengeance is portrayed less as justice and more as ritual, a dance of utility repeated endlessly. Another theme is discipline, both as salvation and as prison. Rooney's identity is rooted in the discipline of ballet, the control of body and movement. That discipline becomes the very foundation of her fighting, allowing her to turn grace into violence. Yet the same discipline also imprisons her, binding her to cycles of repetition, perfection, and control. The Ballet Academy symbolizes this duality, a place of art turned into a factory of killers, a space where discipline elevates and destroys simultaneously. This theme resonates far beyond the film, reminding us of how the very skills that give us strength can also chain us, how discipline can be both freedom and cage. The theme of corruption of beauty runs through every frame. Ballet, once pure expression of elegance, is here repurposed into violence. Theaters, once stages of art, become battlegrounds. Music, once written for grace, is distorted into the soundtrack of death. This corruption is not just aesthetic but symbolic. It speaks of how systems can twist art, how grief can hollow beauty, how violence can consume what was once sacred. Watching a ballerina's leap turn into a killing blow unsettled me not only because of the brutality, but because it showed how easily art can be consumed by cruelty. It reminded me of how beauty in our own world is often commodified, repurposed, exploited until it loses its essence. Isolation is another recurring theme. Despite allies and fleeting connections, Rooney is framed constantly as alone. Wide shots place her as a solitary figure against vast, indifferent cities. Hotel rooms emphasize her solitude, beds too large, silence too heavy. Even her encounters with John Wick reinforce her isolation. They recognize each other, but cannot save each other. Isolation here is not only situational, but existential, a symbol of what grief does. It separates, it hollows, it makes us unreachable. This theme resonates painfully because it is true. Mourning often isolates, not because others do not care, but because the absence we carry cannot be shared. Time is another presence, threaded subtly through the story. Younger opponents embody the future, sharp and fast, while Rooney embodies weariness, fragility, inevitability. The ballet imagery reinforces cycles, repetitions, rehearsals that never end. Time here is not linear but circular, every dance step echoing one before, every act of vengeance another repetition of futility. This cyclical sense of time mirrors a mythology of the larger world the film inhabits, a world where violence repeats endlessly, where codes and rules outlast individuals. Symbolically, time becomes the greatest adversary, the silent force against which no skill can prevail. The use of silence is itself thematic. Moments without dialogue stretch long, filled only with breath, footsteps, echoes. Silence here symbolizes not absence but presence. The presence of grief, of inevitability, of memory. In a world full of noise, silence is the truest sound, the one that forces us to confront what we avoid. These silences critique our discomfort, forcing us to sit with grief rather than escape it. They reminded me of silences in my own life after loss, when words felt meaningless and only the weight of quiet carried truth. Symbols thread through the film with precision. Point shoes symbolize innocence lost, art corrupted. Mirrors symbolize fractured identity, reflections of who she was and who she has become. Stages symbolize performance, both in art and in vengeance. Spaces where movement is watched but meaning is hollow. Blood becomes symbol not only of violence but of inheritance, of legacy carried through bodies. Even rain becomes symbol, washing streets clean yet never cleansing grief. These symbols accumulate until the world itself feels metaphorical, every object carrying weight beyond its function. What fascinates me is how the themes intertwine. Grief fuels vengeance. Vengeance isolates. Isolation deepens grief. Discipline enables survival, but also chains. Beauty corrupted mirrors innocence lost. Time cycles, silence haunts. None of these themes stand alone. They weave together into a tapestry that mirrors human existence itself. The story becomes less about assassins and more about us, about how we carry loss, how we numb it, how we repeat it, how we let it shape our very movements. By the end, the most haunting theme emerges: futility. Rooney kills those who wronged her, yet nothing is restored. The cycle continues. Grief remains, silence endures. This futility is not presented as nihilism, but as honesty. It critiques the illusion of closure, the lie that vengeance can heal, the comfort of redemption arcs. Instead, it offers truth, that some wounds remain, that some dances never end, that grief becomes part of identity. It is a heavy theme, but also strangely liberating, because it reminds us to seek presence, not resolution, to live in awareness rather than in pursuit of impossible closure. Reflecting on these themes and symbols, I realized that the film had changed how I saw not only its world but my own. I looked differently at stages, at mirrors, at silences, at the way grief choreographs even the smallest gestures of my day. That, I think, is the mark of art that lingers. It reshapes perception, turning the ordinary into symbols, the personal into philosophy. The film's themes are not locked in its fiction. They bleed into us, asking us to carry them long after the credits roll. Every film is built not only from story, but from choices, from the grammar of cinema itself. The way a camera moves, the way light falls, the way sound lingers, the way cuts dictate rhythm. These techniques are invisible when they succeed, yet they shape everything we feel, pulling us into the experience until we forget we are watching it all. To look at this film through its techniques is to see the architecture of inevitability, the craft beneath the dance of grief. And to reflect on its box office life is to see how audiences responded collectively, how silence and awe turn into numbers, conversations, and reputation. The camera moves like a participant in the story. In fight sequences, it does not sit passively outside the choreography. It circles, sways, hovers, treating every confrontation as a performance. The perspective feels almost like another dancer, joining Rooney in her deadly ballet. Yet outside of combat, the camera stills, lingers, holds on silences that stretch uncomfortably long. This contrast between fluid movement and frozen stillness embodies the tension between action and grief. In motion, she seems alive, purposeful. In stillness, she seems haunted, consumed. The camera itself becomes a mirror of her psyche, restless when vengeance drives her, paralyzed when grief swallows her. Angles are chosen with deliberate symbolism. High shots shrink her, emphasizing isolation in vast cities, empty theaters, anonymous hotels. Low angles during fights elevate her enemies, making them seem like towering forces even when they fall. Tilted frames disorient, suggesting imbalance, fragility, a world out of alignment. These choices create unease even before violence erupts, making us feel inevitability, not only in story but in perspective. Watching her framed small against neon towers or crooked and fractured mirrors, I felt the weight of isolation more than dialogue ever could. Lighting tells its own story. The film alternates between harsh illumination and suffocating dimness. Arenas and streets blaze with neon. Every drop of sweat and blood visible, beauty and brutality exposed under unforgiving light. By contrast, intimate moments are cloaked in shadows. Faces half-lit, bodies swallowed in gloom, lamps flickering in empty rooms. This play of light and dark mirrors her fractured self, half performer, half mourner, half assassin, half dancer. One haunting image captures her at a vanity, half her face glowing under white light, the other half lost in shadow, a visual metaphor for fractured identity. Light here is philosophy. It sculpts grief into visibility, fractures truth into dualities. Sound is equally meticulous. In battles, the layering of effects creates rhythm. Point shoes scraping wood, breath sharp, strikes echoing like percussion. The The score blends classical strings with electronic distortion, so that elegance collides constantly with menace. But silence carries even more weight. After fights, sound drops suddenly, leaving us in oppressive quiet. In hotel rooms, only the hum of electricity or the creak of furniture remains. These silences force us to sit with grief, refusing escape into constant noise. They reminded me of silences in my own life after moments of collapse, the way absence becomes louder than presence. Editing dictates the heartbeat of the film. Fight sequences are cut like symphonies, quick, rhythmic, building crescendos that crash into sudden rests. Yet moments of grief are drawn out, time stretched unbearably, every second heavy. The rhythm disorients us, mirroring her own oscillation between fury and mourning. One sequence cross-cuts her strikes with flashes of memory, collapsing past and present until they blur. The edit itself becomes philosophy, suggesting that grief never remains in the past. It collides with the present in every movement. The color palette deepens the themes. Early moments retain a trace of warmth, yellows, golds, the last remnants of life before vengeance. But gradually the world desaturates into cold blues, grays, and shadows. Red intrudes violently, blood splashed, neon glowing, curtains torn. These intrusions are not decorative but symbolic, each flash of red a reminder of wounds unhealed. By the end, the palette feels drained of life, the world hollowed to mirror her emptiness. Color becomes emotion, and its draining mirrors her own. Performance technique is shaped by cinematic choices. The director encouraged Anna to move as if still on stage, even in violence. Cameras linger on her grace. Editing emphasizes rhythm. Sound amplifies movement like music. She is not presented as brute force, but as choreography embodied. The result is performance that feels less like acting and more like ritual, every gesture laden with grief. In interviews, she admitted the camera captured exhaustion that was not scripted. Her bruises, her trembling, her gasps. The film embraces those imperfections, making them part of its truth. Together, these techniques weave inevitability into form. The film does not simply tell us that grief consumes. It makes us feel it in silence, in color drained, in angles tilted, in rhythms broken. It is a masterclass in using cinema as philosophy, not just story. And then there's the box office, the story of how audiences responded to these choices. At first, expectations were cautious. Would mainstream viewers embrace a revenge ballet, a spin-off from a larger universe, but steeped more in mourning than in triumph? Studios predicted modest returns, assuming audiences wanted the spectacle of John Wick rather than the meditation of grief. Yet the opening weekend surprised them. Theaters filled, late-night screenings sold out, and reports spread of silence after credits. Audiences did not cheer, they did not clap, they sat still haunted. That hush became part of the film's reputation, turning silence itself into marketing. Critics noted the strangeness of its reception. Some praised its refusal of redemption, calling it bold, raw, honest. Others complained it was too bleak, too heavy, unwilling to flatter viewers with triumph. Yet even the harshest voices admitted they could not stop thinking about it. One critic wrote, "I hated watching it, but I cannot forget it." And that paradox speaks to its power. The box office mirrored this paradox. Not explosive like blockbuster spectacle, but steady, enduring, fueled by word of mouth, by the reputation of silence. Internationally, the film resonated deeply. In Eastern Europe, where ballet is both art and discipline, audiences saw themselves reflected in the corruption of beauty. In Asia, the themes of inevitability and duty resonated with cultural narratives of fate. Even in markets where action films dominate, the unique choreography drew crowds intrigued by something different. The film earned far beyond its projections, proving that audiences crave honesty as much as spectacle. Its success was not only financial but cultural, expanding the boundaries of what this universe could contain. What fascinates me most is how technique and box office intertwined. The tilted frames became tilted hearts. The silences became real silences in theaters. The drained palette became drained conversations afterward. The raw performance became raw emotion carried home. The very techniques that made the film heavy also made it unforgettable, ensuring audiences could not dismiss it as mere entertainment. Its box office success proves that cinema, when honest, can still draw people not for comfort, but for confrontation. Reflecting on all this, I see a paradox mirrored in the film itself. The techniques were meticulous, precise, crafted with discipline. Yet the box office life was unpredictable, shaped by audiences' hunger for something different, something real. That tension between control and unpredictability, between choreography and chaos, is exactly what the film depicts. Just as Rooney cannot control grief, filmmakers cannot control reception. Yet both press forward, creating movement from inevitability. And so the filmmaking techniques and box office story together form their own narrative, a story of precision shaping inevitability, and of audiences responding not with applause but with silence, carrying the weight of what they had seen. That silence, I think, is a real box office number, the unmeasured presence of grief shared in dark rooms, the recognition carried out of theaters. When I think about what makes a story breathe, I think about faces, the eyes that carry grief, the mouths that falter before words, the bodies that tremble even in silence. No script can live without performers who surrender fragments of themselves to it, and no film endures without the echoes of those who watched it, who carried its weight beyond the theater. In this story, the cast gave themselves a vulnerability that feels rare, and their interviews afterward reveal how heavy the process was. And the audience, in turn, received it with a silence that became as much a review as any headline. To speak of the cast and the voices around them is to speak not only of performance but of humanity mirrored. Ana de Armas is the heart of the film, and she carried it with a grace and fragility that critics described as transformative. In interviews, she confessed that the role left her altered. Training consumed her, bruises multiplied, and she admitted that some nights she cried from exhaustion. "I felt like my body didn't know if it was dancing or fighting," she said, half in laughter, half in reflection. That blurring of art and violence is visible in her performance. Her movements precise, her silence is suffocating, her eyes haunted by loss. Watching her interviews, I was struck by how deeply she seemed to still carry Rooney even after filming ended. She admitted to dreaming of stages turning into battlegrounds, of performances ending in silence instead of applause. These words reveal the cost of immersion, the way actors surrender pieces of themselves for our recognition. Keanu Reeves' presence, though brief on screen, became a quiet anchor behind it. In conversations, he spoke warmly of Anna's dedication, describing her as fearless in fragility. He admitted he joined rehearsals not because he needed to, but because he wanted to stand beside her, to pass along rhythm and confidence. His humility resonated with audiences who later praised his appearance as more than cameo. It felt like blessing, like continuity between legends. His interviews reflected his philosophy, the way he sees these characters not as superheroes, but as wounded souls. "Grief is the fuel," he said simply, and that truth carries through both his performance and his mentorship. Anjelica Huston, reprising her role as a director, spoke of the difficulty of revisiting a character so rooted in discipline and cruelty. In interviews, she admitted she drew on her own memories of ballet training as a child, the strictness, the demands, the pain disguised as art. Her words revealed the authenticity behind her presence, the way art can scar even as it shapes. Watching her in the film after hearing her reflections made me realize how much truth she wove into that role. Discipline as beauty, discipline as prison. The supporting cast, too, offered insight. Lance Reddick's performance as Sharon carries an added poignancy, knowing it was among his last. His dignity, his calm presence, his subtle warmth were praised by everyone who worked with him. In one interview, Anna spoke tearfully of his kindness off camera, how he offered encouragement during the most grueling rehearsals. "He carried grace in every gesture," she said, and that grace lingers both in the film and in memory. His performance feels now like a gift, a reminder of how presence can be more powerful than words. Even the stunt performers and choreographers spoke with reverence for the process. They described the rehearsals as exhausting but strangely beautiful, as though they were part of a new art form, somewhere between ballet and combat. One stuntwoman laughed that she never expected to learn pirouettes in a fight gym, yet found herself spinning and leaping with knives in hand. Their interviews reveal how the film reshaped not only actors, but the people who built the choreography. reminding us that art often emerges from unlikely collaborations. Audience reviews carried a tone that matched the heaviness of the cast reflections. Viewers wrote of leaving theaters in silence, some shaken, some tearful, some simply stunned. Many confessed they expected a John Wick-style thrill ride, but instead found meditation on grief that unsettled them. "I thought it would be action, but it was grief disguised as action," one viewer wrote. Another admitted, "I wanted catharsis, but I left hollow, and that honesty hurt in ways I didn't expect." These responses reveal how the film subverted expectations, refusing to flatter audiences with triumph. Instead, it gave them truth, and truth often leaves silence rather than applause. Critics echoed this unease. Some praised the boldness of refusing redemption arcs, calling it one of the most daring spin-offs in modern franchises. Others complained of its bleakness, its refusal to comfort, yet even detractors admitted they could not shake it. One critic wrote, "It sits in me like a bruise, sore long after I left the theater." Another confessed, "I did not enjoy it, but I cannot forget it." These paradoxical reviews became part of its reputation, proof that the film aimed not to please but to haunt. In international markets, reviews took on additional layers. In Eastern Europe, critics connected deeply with the corruption of ballet imagery, noting how discipline and art had often been entangled with cruelty in their own cultural histories. In Asia, reviewers spoke of the inevitability and duty themes, resonating with philosophies of fate. Audiences worldwide recognized themselves in Rooney's silence, in her exhaustion, in her futility. The universality of grief transcended cultural boundaries, making the film resonate even where its franchise connections mattered less. What struck me most, reflecting on all these voices, is how aligned they felt. The cast spoke of exhaustion, of grief carried beyond the set. The crew spoke of rituals to survive heaviness. Audiences spoke of silence and unease. Critics spoke of haunting rather than satisfaction. Everyone, from those who built it to those who watched it, seemed to carry the same recognition. That grief is inescapable, that vengeance is futility, that silence is truth. That alignment is rare, and it makes the film feel less like a product and more like a communal meditation. As I sit with these reflections, I realize that what endures is not only the story on screen, but the faces and voices off it. Anna's haunted confessions, Keanu's humility, Huston's honesty, Reddick's grace, the laughter of stunt performers, the silence of audiences, the contradictions of critics. Together they form the real legacy of the film, a tapestry of human responses bound by grief and beauty. And in that tapestry lies a recognition that cinema is not only illusion, but communion, not only spectacle, but conversation. This film, more than many, proved that truth. When the final frame faded and the screen went black, I found myself sitting in the dark not with triumph or resolution, but with a silence that felt almost unbearable, as though the weight of everything I had just witnessed pressed into my chest and refused to let me move. That silence, I think, is the truest conclusion of this film. Not applause, not catharsis, not comfort, but quiet recognition of grief carried and inevitability fulfilled. To write a conclusion for it is to step carefully into that silence, not to explain away, but to honor it, to reflect on what it revealed, and to carry forward the truths it whispered. The story of Rooney was never only about vengeance, though vengeance was its engine. It was about grief choreographed into movement, about the way absence teaches the body to act long after words fail. Her strikes, her silences, her exhaustion were not about killing enemies alone, but about carrying ghosts, dancing with memory, repeating steps she could never stop. The conclusion of her journey is not victory but futility, not healing but hollow endurance. She survives, yes, but survival feels indistinguishable from collapse, and that is the truth the film refuses to soften. It does not lie to us with redemption. It leaves us instead with honesty. Grief does not end, vengeance does not restore, silence remains. The themes linger like shadows. Inevitability hums through every frame, reminding us that time erodes, that bodies break, that loss cannot be undone. Discipline is shown as both salvation and prison, the very grace that shapes her body, also chaining her to cycles of repetition. Beauty is corrupted. Theaters once filled with art turned into battlegrounds, ballet steps turned into strikes. Love is revealed as fragile, loyalty as brittle, vengeance as futile. All these themes converge in the final silence, telling us that closure is a myth, that presence is the only truth left to us. Watching it, I thought of my own silences after loss, the moments when nothing felt resolved, when absence lingered as the only honest conclusion. This film captured that feeling and held me in it, refusing escape. The symbols reinforce the weight. Point shoes become relics of innocence lost. Mirrors reflect fractured identity. Red intrusions symbolize wounds that never heal. Every object carried metaphor. Every sound whispered philosophy. Even silence itself became symbol, the truest one of all, reminding us that grief cannot be spoken away. By the end, I realized that the story had turned the world into metaphor, and that metaphor lingered beyond the theater. I found myself seeing mirrors differently, hearing footsteps differently, noticing silence differently. That, to me, is the mark of lasting art. It reshapes perception, turning ordinary moments into symbols of truth. The performances gave the conclusion its human face. Ana de Armas carried fragility in every gesture, exhaustion in every silence. Her interviews afterward confirming the cost of such immersion. Keanu Reeves' brief presence gave weight, reminding us of cycles that never end, his humility off-screen mirroring his haunted presence on it. Anjelica Huston and Lance Reddick brought depth and dignity, their roles symbols of discipline and grace, their real voices adding poignancy. The supporting cast, the stunt performers, the choreographers, all left fragments of themselves in the story. Fragments we felt even if we did not see. Their commitment reminded me that cinema is not machine but communion, made of human effort, human exhaustion, human laughter, human grief. Behind the camera, the techniques themselves carried philosophy. Cameras circling like dancers, then holding still in suffocating silences. Lights blazing unforgivingly in violence, then dimming into shadow and grief. Sounds blending point shoes with gunfire, music fusing ballet with distortion, colors draining from warm to cold, reds intruding like wounds, editing weaving rhythm like heartbeat, then stretching time into eternity. All of it designed to make us not just watch but feel inevitability, to make grief not concept but experience. These choices were not decorative. They were the skeleton of meaning, the architecture of despair. And the audiences felt it. The silence in theaters became its own review, its own conclusion. People did not cheer. They sat still, haunted, stunned. Critics admitted they could not forget it even when they wished to. Viewers confessed to seeing themselves in her exhaustion, in her futility, in her silence. International audiences connected with ballet corrupted with inevitability, with grief as universal language. The box office reflected not spectacle but endurance, proof that honesty can succeed even when it unsettles. That communal hush is the truest conclusion of all, a recognition shared in dark rooms, silence carried out into the world as memory. When I think of what the film leaves us with, it is not despair alone, but awareness. Awareness that grief is endless, that vengeance is futility, that silence is truth. Awareness that beauty can be corrupted, that discipline can imprison, that closure is myth. Awareness that presence, however fleeting, however fragile, is all we have. That awareness may not comfort, but it is honest, and honesty is its own kind of grace. And so, in this conclusion, I find myself not summarizing but confessing. I confess that the film left me haunted, that I sat in silence afterward, that I carried its weight into my own reflections. I confess that I admire its refusal to lie, its courage to leave us hollow rather than comforted. I confess that I saw myself in Rooney's exhaustion, in her futility, in her silence. And I confess that I am grateful for the reminder that fragility is truth, that silence is presence, that stories like this do not heal us but teach us to sit with what cannot be healed. To those who gather here in this space, who read or listen not for spectacle but for reflection, I want to thank you. Thank you for carrying this journey with me, for honoring silence with me, for allowing cinema to become conversation, philosophy, mirror. If you found something in these words, if the film lingered in you as it lingered in me, I ask you to stay close, to subscribe, to walk with me into future reflections where films become meditations on what it means to be human. Because what makes this worthwhile is not views or numbers but recognition, the shared silence that tells us we are fragile together. Ballerina may have been its title, but what it revealed was not performance, not vengeance, not even death, but humanity. Tender, fractured, exhausted, graceful even in collapse. That is the truest conclusion, the one that matters more than plot, more than spectacle, more than legacy. That is what I carry, and I hope it is what you carry too.